I have a love-hate relationship with libertarians. We are so close on so many issues, but then they always say something to frustrate me. First of all, I don't think their doctrines can be applied consistently in the real world. But most frustrating is when they don't apply their doctrines consistently. A great example of this is the application of their principle of self-ownership to the question of slavery. I'm not going to pronounce any judgment here on slavery as such. I want to discuss purely what I see as an inconsistency in the libertarian position. This is occasioned by a recent article by Wanjiru Njoya. I follow her on Twitter. She's great. I thoroughly recommend you follow her as well. In the article, she builds on Murray Rothbard's old condemnation of pro-slavery libertarians. She summarizes Rothbard's position thusly: property rights emanate from self-ownership, so any attempt by one man to own another is in itself a violation of the most basic principle of property rights. Rothbard himself writes, "If every man has a property right in his own person, this immediately negates any grotesquely proclaimed property right in other people." Why, nothing can be further from the truth. Slavery necessarily and directly emanates from the principle of self-ownership. I will not go now into a detailed discussion about what it is precisely that a man owns in himself. But if we admit that a man has a property right in himself, as Rothbard does, then we must admit that whatever it is he owns in himself, he can sell. If he owns himself, he can sell himself. And having sold oneself, he can be sold again by his new owner. Wanjiru Njoya and Murray Rothbard can claim that this defense of slavery lacks moral foundation. But they are plainly wrong. What moral right do they have to tell a man that he cannot sell his property? They will tell him, well, you own your car and you can sell your car. You own your land, you can sell your land. Well, you own yourself, but no, you mustn't sell yourself. You cannot sell yourself, it is impossible. My question to libertarians is this: if you can forbid a man to sell whatever property he has in himself, why can't another person forbid a man to sell whatever property he has in land, or another property he finds inalienable or sacred? Rothbard writes that such pro-slavery defense of property rights is fetishistic. On the contrary, it is his treatment of the right to liberty and self-ownership as something inalienable, or at least unsellable, is fetishistic. He would consider it sheer authoritarianism if another species of property was treated in such a way. I know some libertarians, agree with my reasoning thus far, they will admit that a man can sell himself, but they will say that he cannot be forced into slavery under any circumstances. Why, this again is completely inconsistent. If a man is true owner of himself and has property in himself, then that property can be confiscated as reparation for crime or debt. Surely, if a man steals from you, you expect him to pay you back, to return what he took, or give something of his own of equivalent value, and indeed more than equivalent, since if a man stole $100 and then was caught and just had to return it, and no more, why, he would simply try to steal again and again until he would be successful. Therefore, he must give more than he took, so that he will be at a loss and be deterred from further crime. Through his ill action, he incurs a debt which he must repay from his own property. And the same goes for other debts he has. If he has no other property, then his future labor has to be confiscated, and he must be enslaved. At least, so it appears to me from the principle of self-ownership. So, if we allow voluntary enslavement to be legitimate, we must allow involuntary one to be also legitimate. And if we allow reparation for crime to be a sufficient cause for slavery, then we must also admit that capture in a just war also is a sufficient cause, because the aggressor, the unjust participant of a war, is committing a sort of crime, and the innocent party deserves reparation. Also, in having the right to defend himself during a war, a soldier has the right to deprive his enemy of his life. And in depriving him of his life, he also deprives him of his liberty and property. He who has the right to take away the entirety has the right to take away any part of it. We must admit that he has the right to spare his enemy's life and merely deprive him of his liberty and property. This has been a principle of the law of nations since time immemorial, for a very simple reason. It serves to preserve the life of soldiers and their families. It helps to ameliorate the brutal conditions of warfare. It aligns the demands of charity with the self-interest of soldiers. Being entitled to the work of their enemies, they now have a good incentive to capture rather than kill them, and to spare the civilians. Each of those causes flows one from another, and they all have their root in the principle of self-ownership. Of the just causes for slavery commonly admitted by theologians and jurists, only one remains: birth from a slave mother. I think this too can be defended and based in the right of self-ownership, or rather of the natural ownership of one's own children. But this is a separate matter, and I will not go into this today. Suffice it to say that children, being dependent on their parents, have to follow their condition. I do not understand on what grounds Rothbard supports abolition. And he is correct. This isn't a matter of merely antiquarian interest. The principles involved are important today. They have their application to other spheres of our life. His next point in particular I find both important and frankly revolting. I generally have great dose of respect for him, but this baffles me. He maintains that the slaves not only should have been freed, but also, he writes, I quote, "The plantations should have reverted, he says, to the ownership of the slaves, those who were forced to work them, and not have remained in the hands of their criminal masters." Then he further writes that there is an even more just alternative to merely giving the slaves the plantations and freeing them. I quote, "The punishment of the criminal masters for the benefit of their former slaves, in short, the imposition of reparations or damages upon the former criminal class for the benefit of their victims." Consider the full absurdity of what Rothbard is saying here. The former slaves are not only supposed to take the land, it reverts to their ownership. How? Imagine you live in the South during that period of time. You become successful, you buy some land, and then you do what other successful men do. You buy some slaves to work there. And then abolition comes, and now the land belongs to the slaves, according to Mr. Rothbard. When did they acquire it? You bought it legitimately, I think. And if you didn't, then it should revert to the person who owned it before you, not to the slaves. Not only that, in the eyes of Mr. Rothbard and people like him, you are a criminal and should be punished. For what? What guilt have you incurred? When? You bought slaves, as is accepted in your culture, as is legal in your country, as has been legal and accepted for thousands of years on every inhabited continent, according to every religion. Before you buy your slaves, you open up your Bible to Leviticus 25:44, and you read, "Let your bondmen and your bondwomen be of the nations that are around you, and of the strangers that sojourn among you, or that were born of them in your land. These you shall have for servants, and by right of inheritance shall leave them to your posterity, and shall possess them forever." Then you open up the New Testament, and you find no condemnation of slavery. You ask your priest. He has no condemnation. Who is Mr. Rothbard to then come and condemn you as a criminal? There is nothing self-evident in the evil of slavery. Again, it has been practiced by all of humanity, and with good reasons. As we said, It protects lives during war. It often helps the poor who have nothing but their own persons to sell. Rothbard attempts to give some justification for his condemnation of slavery in his book The Ethics of Liberty. There he writes, I quote, "The distinction between a man's alienable labor service and his inalienable will may be further explained. A man can alienate his labor service, but he cannot sell the capitalized future value of that service. In short, he cannot, in nature, sell himself into slavery and have this sale enforced, for this would mean that his future will over his own person was being surrendered in advance. In short, a man can naturally expend his labor currently for someone else's benefit, but he cannot transfer himself, even if he wished, into another man's permanent capital good, for he cannot rid himself of his own will, which may change in future years, and repudiate the current arrangement. The concept of voluntary slavery is indeed a contradictory one, for so long as a laborer remains totally subservient to his master's will voluntarily, he is not yet a slave, since his submission is voluntary, whereas if he later changed his mind and the master enforced his slavery by violence, the slavery would not be voluntary." End quote. First of all, Rothbard is completely wrong in asserting that a slave surrenders his will. This is merely a civil arrangement. It does not change the nature of a man as a free creature. He does not become an automaton because he is bound to obey another man. We were all, as children, obliged to obey another, and without our consent, and yet I think we all remember that we possessed free will even then. We did not receive it when we became emancipated from our parents. Free workers, priests, soldiers, all are bound to obey another, and yet they remain human beings, free human beings. That is, they possess free will. All the slave has given up is his civil liberty. I say given up in case of a voluntary enslavement, or he was deprived of it in case of involuntary enslavement. The second problem with Rothbard's position is his denial that a man can bind himself in such a way that he cannot change his mind later. If a contract is illegitimate because it cannot be freely abandoned when a person changes his mind, then notice that it completely invalidates, amongst other things, marriage contracts. Marriage becomes a sort of slavery, since it cannot be freely abandoned. Ability of human beings to bind themselves by contracts is, in my opinion, the very basis of civilization. Rothbard's position seems to me completely antisocial, opposed to all civilization. Entering into a contract is and must be voluntary, but the fulfillment of it necessarily is based on coercion. This and this alone imposes order on the chaos of human interactions and allows us to plan long term. Rothbard is perfectly correct that this is coercion. In essence, this is slavery. But this alone allows for the stability of human interactions and relationships necessary to provide in our youth for the necessities of our old age. I will give you an example. I was at a political gathering once where a politician proposed to end our Polish version of social security, or at least remove the compulsion and make it voluntary. One member of the audience protested emphatically. He gave a reason which many found laughable, but I think it deserves a serious consideration. He said that it has to be compulsory, because if it isn't, he will spend all his money on drink, and then he will be left penniless and destitute in his old age. That man understood that he needed coercion to survive. He wanted it, he consented to it, he longed for it. I don't think it is legitimate for him and people like him to impose coercion on us all, to deprive all of us of our money just so it can be saved by the government and then paid out to us. But it is legitimate for him to voluntarily enter into what Rothbard would consider a slave contract, where he has gathered all his will and he understands that he needs it, and consent to provide to someone else labor for his entire life in return for care in his old age. Or, if he lacks the strength of will to agree to such a contract, then, if being left destitute or succumbing to the nefarious influence of alcoholism, he resorts to crime to support his habit, then he should be forced into such an arrangement. I see no legitimacy in Rothbard denying him that right. Rothbard extends his antisocial premises even to parental authority. I quote, "Regardless of his age, we must grant to every child the absolute right to run away and to find new foster parents who will voluntarily adopt him or to try to exist on his own. Parents may try to persuade the runaway child to return, but it is totally impermissible enslavement and an act of aggression upon his right of self-ownership for them to use force to compel him to return. The absolute right to run away is the child's ultimate expression of his right of self-ownership, regardless of age." End quote. My dear libertarians, do you agree with this? Do you believe that your children have the right to run away and you are not allowed to apprehend them and bring them back? I agree, this is certainly consistent with libertarian principles. After all, the child signed no contract, it made no agreement. The parental authority is entirely based on coercion, on the parent's natural right to extend dominion over children. So if you deny the right to coerce anyone, I suppose you must admit that children ultimately have no obligation to obey their parents and stay with them. But do you not realize what madness Rothbard is proposing? This is an assault on the fundamental institution of society. In service to a fetish, an idol of imagined natural liberty, he is destroying parental authority, rights of marriage, and contract law. To further demonstrate the disastrous consequences of his position, I yet again quote from The Ethics of Liberty. Libertarians, being opposed to the draft as compulsory slavery, have no difficulty in calling for total exoneration for deserting draftees. But what of enlistees, who enlisted in the army voluntarily, and setting aside the case of those who may have enlisted only as an alternative to the compulsory draft? The promise theorist must strictly advocate both punishment of the deserters and their compulsory return to the armed forces. The title transfer theorist, on the contrary, maintains that every man has the inalienable right to control his own body and will, since he has that inalienable control in natural fact, and therefore that the enlistment was a mere promise which cannot be enforceable, since every man has the right to change his mind at any time over the disposition of his body and will. Thus, seemingly minor and abstruse differences over the theory of contracts can and do imply vital differences over public policy." End quote. I will not consider the question of the draft here, but notice he claims those who enlisted voluntarily cannot be compelled because they made a simple promise. He calls his position the title transfer theory. He's completely wrong. I stand for the title transfer. The man who voluntarily enlisted did not make a simple promise. He transferred the title to his liberty, and indeed, even his life. He sold himself. He can be compelled to fulfill the terms of his contract. He can be forced to do so. He can be punished. And in case of a soldier, his life can even be expended for the defense of his homeland. What remains of all contracts, of all agreements, if everyone has the inalienable right to change his mind? At what point can he change his mind? If he enlisted and actually showed up to the battlefield, can he change his mind in the middle of the battle and simply run away? Can he change his mind when he doesn't like the order? What remains of the military discipline under this system? What remains of any contract, of any society? I need not even mention that all religious vows are of course completely obliterated by this. Rothbard, however, is not completely consistent with his condemnation of slavery. He does, after all this talk of inalienable rights and monstrous crime of slavery, of a criminal class of masters, he does recognize just enslavement. And precisely on one of the grounds I already listed before, as a punishment for crime, as a restitution. I will quote his own words. "Suppose that, as in most cases, the thief has already spent the money, In that case, the first step of proper libertarian punishment is to force the thief to work and to allocate the ensuing income to the victim until the victim has been repaid. The ideal situation, then, puts the criminal, frankly, into a state of enslavement to his victim, the criminal continuing in that condition of just slavery until he has redressed the grievance of the men he has wronged. So it turns out the right to liberty is not inalienable. Man can in fact be enslaved to another. Since Rothbard also accepts death penalty, the right to life is also not inalienable. I have a question for the supporters of Mr. Rothbard. Suppose the victim to whom the criminal is enslaved as restitution does not want to wait until the criminal works and produces enough goods to repay the debt. Instead, the victim decides to transfer his title of ownership and sell his slave to another man so that he can receive his restitution quickly and another more patient man can extract the value from the former criminal, now slave. Would that be valid? If so, why the condemnation of the southern planters? They bought their slaves believing that they were either captives of war, in which perhaps they were aggressors, or that they were condemned for some crimes, deserving of such punishment by their tribal chieftains. Thus they were acquired perfectly justly and were sold to slave traders who transported them across the Atlantic, and they were simply purchased by enterprising southern gentlemen. Why must we deprive the master of his slaves and his land, and, of course, make him a slave to his former slaves, because he has to pay restitution, according to Mr. Rothbard? After all the principles of inalienable rights, we simply end up with an ideology of revolution. The old slaves become masters, and their former masters become their slaves. Someone will perhaps object that this slavery as restitution is of a different kind. Well, certainly it is based on coercion, but perhaps someone will say it is only temporary. It is only for as long as the criminal repays his debt. Well, it makes sense if he stole a sum of money, but what if he is a murderer? How long until he repays the worth of a human life? He can only do so by working his entire life. A life for a life, the principle of proportionality. And what if he killed more than one person? We can take only one life from him, but if it is fair to make him a slave, perhaps it is also fair to make his children pay off his debt, also as slaves. Rothbard establishes an absurd system where a man can be compelled to be a slave if he is a criminal, but if he is poor and starving, he is not allowed to sell himself voluntarily. Why not? If you can deprive a man of his liberty and if you can deprive a man of his life, if that right is alienable, if he can alien it by committing a crime, why can't he alien it by his own sovereign decision? My dear libertarians, if you insist on being libertarians, at least stand for the real property rights. Be those pro-slavery libertarians that Rothbard condemned. Accept that if a man owns himself, he has the right to sell his property. If he can alien it by crime, accept that he can alien it by his own decision. And accept that if certain men can be condemned to be slaves for their crimes, then the presumption of ownership must be in favor of the southern planters, and abolition was nothing but mass robbery, and if any reparations are owed, they are owed to the descendants and heirs of the robbed slaveholders, not of the slaves.